Hey guys, welcome to support show number 4. These are the different types of end mills. We've got a V. This one is used for doing more intricate work, mostly on wood and plastics. And it's going to be a workhorse if you do a lot of engraving. This is one of the primary end mills that I use is a V bit. The next would be, this is just a standard end mill. This is a flat end mill. You can see it is flat on the end, and this is meant for cutting. You could use this for pockets, and this type of end mill is really versatile. You could use it through most materials, and if not all materials. This particular one is coated. That's why it's this gold color. So if you have one and it's not coated, it's probably the same thing. This one's just meant for cutting aluminum. There's a ball end. This is really similar to a flat, but the end of it is rounded. Get a good video of that. And this one will work a lot better on 3D things. So when you're cutting stuff that have like a 3D contour that's rounded, this is what you want to use so you don't get blocky edges. And this will also, if you're just doing a regular pocket, this will give you texture on the bottom. This is one of my favorite newer end mills that we've gotten. This is a diamond drag. This one's got a little itty bitty diamond on the very tip of it. And this one can engrave in most materials. I would say most hard materials. If you're doing something like wax, it's going to engrave in it, but it's probably not going to do a great job. You want to use this more for metals, and it works pretty good on plastics too. But I use it mostly for metals. And then this is another type of flat end mill. This is a McFly cutter. This is actually more of a surfacing end mill. You can see how much larger it is in comparison to one of this type of end mill. So they're basically the same thing, just one of them's a little bit bigger. So let me show a couple examples of kind of how they work. So let's say we have a piece of stock and it's flat. So I'll draw it out here. Let me use actually the larger one. So we're going to use this as an example. So we have a flat piece of material. I know this is a drawn material, so obviously it's not that flat. But so I'll show you how each of these end mills kind of cuts. So we've got a V-bit. That one, when it cuts through material, let me draw the second line here. That one is going to cut like this into the material. As you can see, it's just like that. So the V-bit, it does a really good job at chamfers. And like I said, it also does a really good job at engraving materials. This is what, when I first started using CNC, this is what I primarily used, was because it was easy for me to do the designs because Carbide Create automatically designed the projects for this, as in it auto makes the tool paths for them. So you just select the section, kind of like you would a pocket, and it's going to decide how deep it needs to go based on the angle. So that's another thing to talk about too, is the V-bits will go deeper the sharper they are. So this end mill, this one I believe is a 60 degree. So we also have a 90. The 90 degree is flatter, so it's going to be more like this. And so when it cuts, it's not going to go as deep because it's going to calculate it based off of the width of the cut. So let's say we were doing a box like this, and I wanted to engrave the outside of the box. So this area is what I'm looking at engraving. When you use a sharper end mill, it's going to go deeper because of the width on this edge, and well, actually on all the edges put together. So if you want something deeper, you want to use a sharper end mill. If you want something shallower, you want to use a less sharp end mill. So that's one thing that people get confused with sometimes when they're setting up a V-carve, because they think that they can decide how deep it goes, but it's not going to allow you to do that. There is a different kind of cut that's an advanced V-carve in Carbide Create. And what advanced V-carve is going to do is it's going to allow you to determine a pocket size. So let's say that I wanted something that is a certain depth. Let's say we'll do it at an eighth of an inch. A advanced V-carve is going to cut a pocket down as deep as you want it. So let's say we wanted it to go, like I said, an eighth of an inch. So it's going to go down an eighth of an inch and pocket the whole thing out. And once it's done doing that, it's going to go back with the V-bit and it's going to do the edges. So it'll kind of do a chamfer around everything. And that gives you that higher end detail where if you were to do a regular pocket, it's not going to do. And if you're going to do an advanced V-carve, let's say your material wasn't that thick, this is going to allow you to decide how thick it is and still get those chamfers. So that's just a basic overview of how a V-bit works and how V-carve and advanced V-carve works. So the next one that we have is a flat end mill. So a flat end mill is, you can typically use them for pockets and for contour cuts to where you're cutting certain things out. So it's going to do a square cut. And that's your pocket, and that's going to be what you're cutting out. One thing to note about this, since these end mills are round, if you go to cut something out that's a square, since the edges are round, it's going to add like a little rounded edge on each side because of the way that the end mills work. So that's why a lot of people want to use a V-bit when they're doing square objects if you're engraving, because that'll give you a sharp point on the edges. If not, you can use a smaller flat end mill, and that'll allow you to get a little bit better on the edges like that. You could use something like rest machining, and rest machining will allow you to do a whole pocket, and it'll do all of the interior and then go back over with a smaller end mill and you can do the edges. A ball end mill is going to cut more of a rounded section like this. And these really shine when you're doing 3D objects, because if, let's say you're drawing something or you're engraving or cutting something that's like a dome shape, using one of these flat end mills, you're going to have little like stairs. So using the rounded one, it's going to give you the rounded edges like this. So that's primarily what those ones, that's what I use them for, is doing 3D contours and that kind of stuff. But they're very similar to a flat end mill. They just do a little bit of a different job with the 3D stuff. The next one we have is a diamond drag. Now, a diamond drag, the way I like to think about them is, let's say that this is an 1/8 inch end mill and you want to engrave something. When you engrave something really fine, this is going to have a really hard time doing it because the size that it is, and also the way that these cut, you're removing material. With a diamond drag, you're using something really tiny. So it's basically just drawing little lines. I have a couple examples of that as well, which would be something like this. I don't know if we'll be able to see that in the light there, but you can see the detail on this is a lot better than what a standard end mill is going to do. You can see on here that center portion was cut out with an end mill, and then the edges were the lettering and everything that was done with the etcher. So that's what those ones are primarily used for. Then the next one that we would be going to, which is a McFly cutter. So the McFly is basically this end mill, just big. So you'd be cutting large areas out, and usually you want to go shallow with that kind of stuff, like if you're going to surface something. So you want to go basically where you're just cutting little cuts into it. You don't want to do a full plunge with something like this, because it's meant to remove a shallow amount of material, but a lot of it. So from there, those are the different types of end mills that are out there. They can be used for all sorts of things. I know every single one of our machines of the Shipokos comes with one of these 201s. This is an excellent end mill to start with, just to practice, to see what you're doing, to kind of understand, because this one is heavily tested, so we know most materials on this end mill. And the one thing that I will recommend, that I typically recommend in everything I do, is to buy learning material. And when I say learning material, I mean like spare MDF, whatever material that you're going to be cutting, you want to get spare of it so that you can just do a couple pockets. What I always recommend when I do onboarding calls is to either do a circle or a square. And they don't have to be big. You could do 1-inch circle, 1-inch square. And the reason why that's so nice is because when you do a 1-inch square, it's very easy for me to take a set of calipers and measure the edges of it just to see if it's cutting properly, what the surface finish looks like. And when you do a pocket, you'll be able to see on the bottom exactly what it looks like, and also you'll be able to see an edge. So that's a really good tool for testing material and also troubleshooting your machine, because it's hard to troubleshoot these sometimes, especially when we're on a video call. We're physically not there trying to check and see if something's going wrong, and sending over an image of a pocket that you've cut can give us a lot of information. So I definitely recommend getting that kind of stuff. The other cool thing that I forgot to mention about this diamond drag, not to hop around too much, but it's spring loaded. So the reason why that's so nice is that if you're cutting something that's not completely flat, this will allow you to engrave on things that aren't flat. Like I recently did a flask for a wedding, and the groom had asked me to use a certain design. And it was something that I could have probably done with a different end mill, or we could have probably done something in vinyl, but I wanted it to be a little bit more special, kind of like, let me see if I can grab my example, like this, where maybe a little bit harder to see. This is a MacBook that we engraved using one of the MC etchers, and you can see the detail in it is pretty amazing. So this is an example of what you can do with something like an MC etcher. And I mean, it's pretty limitless what you can do with these kinds of end mills. Other than that, I would just go out, take a piece of MDF, test all your projects before you cut them. Just scrap material that I have laying around. That's pretty much it with these end mills. Let me flip over to my other camera real quick. So, in conclusion with that, there are a lot of different kinds of end mills out there, and I get asked often, you know, different end mills, what should I purchase, that kind of stuff. We're going to go over that in the next topic, but I wanted to open up the floor so that anyone in here can ask some questions about end mills, and we can answer those right now. I see in our questions are, what are Z-coated end mills for? The Z-coated end mills are for cutting metals. There's certain metals that it's made for. The ones that we carry are typically for cutting aluminum, but you can use them on other metals. Like I use them on brass pretty often. There are other types for cutting specific metals, as in I've seen ones that are for cutting like stainless steel, that kind of stuff, which is, stainless steel is incredibly hard to cut. But yeah, that's what these coated end mills are for. So we got a question, what are ball end mills used for? Like I kind of touched on earlier, the ball end mills or ball nose end mills are more for 3D designs where you're basically going over a curve, in comparison to where if you were doing something like a flat end mill, it's going to go up and kind of make stairs. So the ball end mill would do a better job at doing the 3D stuff. And this, if you use a ball end mill to do pockets, it'll also make a texture in the bottom of the stock. That's kind of what they are. They're a cool end mill. I don't use them super often because I don't do too many of the 3D designs. Most of the stuff that I do is engraving on a pre-made stock. But I know Kevin's done some really cool things with this. We have a colleague, Oscar. Oscar has done some really cool stuff with the ball end mills. So definitely, if you get a chance to try one out, I would definitely recommend to just maybe do a 3D thing here and there, and go from there. So a 501 and a 502, those are PCB bits. So what those are typically for, they're pretty much the same thing as like a V bit, but they're meant for cutting PCB boards. So those end mills, you can actually use them interchangeably like you would a standard V bit. I didn't bring any up here because I had the larger end mill. They're kind of hard to see in video, but the 501 and 502, I use them a lot for engraving in brass, and I use them for copper. So when I first started doing this kind of stuff, we didn't have a diamond drag. So I was using those, and I was going down about 1 thou to 2 thou to engrave into brass. But I now use them a lot for doing stuff like wax seals, like the old school, where you would take a blob of wax and you'd stamp it and you'd send a letter out. That's what I use them for. And they work pretty great. The other thing that I use them for is going back and doing details in something smaller. So they can be used interchangeably, like I said, like a V-bit, but they're mostly, they're designed to do PCB boards. But I mean, that's the cool thing about these, is that they're more designed for that kind of stuff. Having an issue with fuzzy finishes on my project. How can I fix this without sanding afterwards? So the issue that people run into having fuzzy finishes a lot of the times comes from the material. Depending on what you're cutting, it could be that the material is still wet. I've seen that before. If you're purchasing your wood from somewhere, I would typically recommend to let it sit out for 24 to 48 hours. Not in the rain, of course, but putting it out so that it can dry up a little bit, that helps. The other thing too, it may be that the end mill is a little bit dull, and that could be causing something like that. One way that you can get rid of that kind of stuff, or kind of help out with it, is you could always run the project a second time, and when it goes back through, it should clear up a little bit of that stuff. But there is always going to be a little bit of post-processing depending on what you're trying to do, especially with wood. I think that you can definitely engrave in something, or you can cut something without doing post-processing, but it just depends on what you want it to look like. The fuzzy finish, I haven't really seen it on oak or maple because those are harder woods. So I would think that you wouldn't get that, but I would just double check to make sure the material's isn't damp at all, and also that your end mill is really sharp. A down cutting bit in comparison to an up cutting bit, basically a down cutting, the spiral. So this is an upcut. So the spiral pulls your material when you're cutting, it pulls it up and away from your stock. A down cut is pushing it down. So the big difference between the two is that an upcut is going to give you better surface quality on the bottom side of your stock, and a down cut is going to give you better surface quality on the top. So there's also there's a compression bit that kind of does both, but the compression bit, you have to have the correct size flute on that when you're cutting your material, and the speeds and feeds need to be set to a certain amount for it to cut properly. So on those type of end mills, they're really cool to have, but you also need to know what you're doing when you go to use them. The next topic we're going to go to is what end mill should I use? I get asked that question, I don't know, probably 10 times a week. Going through the onboarding calls, that's kind of one of the things that we go over is when there's a new project or you're just starting off, you kind of don't know what you need to use for your cuts. And that's completely understandable because I didn't know either. And it just depends on what you're doing. The only thing about that question is that it is a very hard question to answer. It's very similar to asking you know, being an artist and saying, what paintbrush should I use? Or asking an artist, what paintbrush should I use? Well, it depends. What are you painting? What do you want it to look like? What style, what kind of paint are you using? There's all sorts of things that go into it. So let's go over a couple different things that you can do. Let me grab another sheet of paper and we'll do some drawing here. I'm a very visual learner, so I like to draw things out. We went over the different types of end mills. There's all sorts of them. And depending on what you're trying to cut out, if you are doing a full cutout, if you're doing an engrave, if you're I mean, there's so many different possibilities on what you can do. So I'll go over kind of how I determine what I'm going to use and how I'm going to use it. And I'll also go over kind of just some tips and tricks to cutting more detailed and more complicated designs. So we'll start off with the most common. We'll go with this flat end mill. So the flat end mill, if you are doing something, let's say you have a sign, and I'm going to draw the stock. So this is the stock. It is a beautiful piece of, let's say, maple. And I wanted to cut a sign that says my name on it. We'll just put Nick. And this sign, I actually don't want it the size of the stock. I want it to be cut out, and I want it to have rounded edges like this. So with this type of cut, there's two end mills that I would recommend to use. So the first one that we're going to go and use as a tool path is I would probably do the V-bit first, because what I want to do is I want to cut this lettering first. And I always do that first. Honestly, it doesn't matter which one you use. I just feel that this one is safer because you're not actually cutting the material out at that point. This is how I was taught to do engraving and to cut signs. So we're going to use this V-bit to cut out the lettering, because it's going to cut like this, and it'll cut my whole name out using that. So then after we're done doing that, we're going to flip back over to a flat end mill so that we can cut out the edges, because this end mill is going to cut flat into the stock. So it's going to cut like this. And this end mill we're going to use to cut all the way the contour around the edges. And that will give me my item that I can pull off of out of the stock. Now, another question that I get asked a lot is about offsets with doing contour cuts. So I'll kind of go over that real quick briefly. So there's different kinds of offsets. Let's say we have a line, and this is the line that we want to cut. You can follow this with no offset. So this is no offset. If we're cutting outside of the material based off of what we're showing here, there is a right side offset. So what this end mill is going to do when you're cutting, if there's no offset, it's going to follow this line, and it's going to cut that all the way around the material. Well, let's say you don't want it to make your stock any smaller. You want it to be an exact size. So doing a right offset on this design it'll draw another line like this around your stock so that when it's cutting, it's going to cut the exact size that you've told it to cut out. So that will give you, you're cutting a item out of a piece of stock. Let's say you want to cut into a piece of stock. Like let's say I wanted to cut a circle right here and I wanted this to be 1 inch. That would be an inside left contour because we're cutting inside and we're cutting a piece into the stock. So, or into the design. So instead of it being on the outside where we're getting the stock to the right hand side size, we're going to cut to the left hand side. So it'll cut into something. A lot of the times you don't have to do this as a contour. You can also do it as a pocket. They kind of both work the same way, just depending on how you want it to cut. But this would make it so that it's a little bit faster, but you'll have to put tabs unless you don't care if the stock comes off. So that's just brief on that. But so that would be the two types of end mills that I would use for this, would be a V-bit and that. So let's go over the next type. So let's say I'm cutting something out and I'm cutting, here's my stock again. Let's say I'm cutting something that is kind of rounded on the top and I want to cut it out. So it's like this. So the first end mill that we're going to use would be this rounded one, because what we're doing is we're basically taking this end mill and going over in a curve. And so that curve is going to only be capable or only be able to be done with a ball end mill. If you were to use something flat, like I said before, it'll basically make stairs because it's not able to do that. So you'll get rigid edges. It's just not great. So then let's say we wanted to cut this out. We're going to go back and we're going to use this end mill again. So we're going to do cuts that are like this with the ball, and we're going to do cuts like this with the flat. So that's how I would go about doing something like that. And you don't have to cut that out. Let's say this is out of a piece of wood. It's already measured to where you want it to be. You could just do this or the rounded one, and that'll allow you to do that kind of design. So the next one that we're going to go over is the etcher. So the etcher is pretty cool. Like I showed in these examples, this is something that we both cut out and engraved. So if we wanted to do something like that, like cool, let's just say a rounded earring, something like that. And I wanted the Carbide logo inside. So this end mill, the way that the engraved feature works is it's going to basically draw lines inside, similar to a pocket. You can have it do multi-direction, so you can have it do cuts that are like an X, or you can just do single lines. The other cool thing about the engraved feature is that the direction of the lines, you can change it as well. So if you wanted it to be like this and then like this, you can change the way that it cuts or engraves. Similar to, if you look on here, I know it's kind of hard to see. We have some examples of this on our Instagram, but you can see that the different designs on there, that comes from spacing with the engrave, and it also comes from the angle of the engrave. So it just depends on what you want it to look like. The other thing that you can do is, where I explained the offsets, you can do a no offset, and it would basically draw out your design. So instead of it being filled in, it would be something like this, where it would just be the exterior that is drawn out. So that's how those work. And these I find to be really versatile. I use them sometimes for doing dog tags, where if you have a dog tag like this, how I go about doing this kind of cut, I completely drew that wrong, but how I go about doing this kind of cut is I do a design. I cut the exterior using one of these flat end mills. Most of the time I use a 16th inch because how small that cut is. And the smaller the end mill with that kind of stuff, the less drag that it has on it. And I think that it cuts a little bit better. I wouldn't want to use something like this, and maybe you could use something like an 1/8 inch, but I use a 1/16 based on what size it is. The way that you figure that out is determined on how detailed you want the interior cuts like this and this kind of stuff. So after I do that cut using a flat end mill, I go back through with this etcher and I would engrave a name on it. Like one of my dogs that I watch is Luna. So it would go back through depending on your font, and it would go and either trace it like this, or it's going to do a pocket with these kind of lines. So that's how I'd go about doing that. And then just a quick little trick that I do, I take a piece of acrylic and I do a pocket that is basically this design of the dog tag. And so instead of having to double side tape or do anything like that, I have a pocket that is the exact size of that aluminum tag in a piece of acrylic. So I just take one of the machines and do that. And you could just snap it into it. So if you're doing multiple or a bunch of them at a time, you don't have to keep setting the 0 on it. You could just pop that in there and do it from there. So other than that, the McFly cutter, this is for surfacing. Like I said, this would be for if your piece of wood that you want to cut, you want to clean up the top of it and make sure that it's flat, you would go ahead and use this. So a lot of the times when you're buying a piece of wood, they come crowned or bowed. So you'll get it and it'll have like a little bit of a crease kind of in the top, or like a crescent. So what this is going to do is this is going to go through and cut that so that it's flat. And that makes it a little bit better for when you're engraving. And also when you set your 0, you're not having to worry about, let's say you set your 0 up here, it's gonna start cutting when it's flat. If you set your 0 and it's off, you have all of this area here that's not flat, and it won't start cutting until it gets down here. So let me just make sure I'm not forgetting anything. But other than that, that's basically how you would use different end mills and which ones you should use depending on what project you're trying to cut. And I know I went over mostly wood today with this kind of stuff, but most of these end mills, other than like this guy and this guy, I wouldn't use those in any kind of metal. But these flat end mills, you could still use these to cut out aluminum or brass, copper. There's all sorts of things, and this works great in metals. I mean, it really, really works great in metals. The one thing that I would recommend if you're doing something like jewelry like this, is I would cut the piece of material out first, and you may want to do a little bit of polishing on it before you actually do the engraving, so that you get as clear a product as you can get off of this. Because these were pulled straight off, and you can see they're pretty shiny. And I mean, these ones came out really great. But a lot of the times, if you're using a material that is I use a lot of kind of scrap brass, and a lot of the times it's really scratched up. So I polish them first, and then I go ahead and I do the cuts. So that's one tip to save some time and a little bit of effort. All right, guys. Well, thank you for being here. Our next show is going to be June 9th. And make sure you bring your questions, because we're here to answer them. So I'll see you then. This is Nick, and you guys have a wonderful day.